Hi, everybody. As you may guess from the title, this is about something called observable content. Quick show of hands. Does that phrase mean anything to anyone? Larry, you don't count. Because you talk to everybody and you know everything. So it's totally unfair. So before getting into any kind of lead up or whatever, I hate the big reveal idea thing. So I'm just going to front load the important concept here. First, content is a strategic investment that companies spend lots of money to create because it will ultimately pay off in some fashion, either because it's their product that they sell, or it helps them reach customers, or it lowers their support costs, or any number of reasons. They invest in it because it pays off. But that also means that the teams that produce and manage content are always under pressure to demonstrate their ROI. Like, why are we spending X million dollars a year on a platform? Or why do we have this army of people creating content or whatever? There's always that pressure. And I think, the environment we're in right now, where lots of large organizations are sort of looking at anything that isn't a GPU and asking why they should pay for it, that's a significant felt need to be able to demonstrate ROI. And most organizations actually do have giant piles of data about their content and about their web presence and about their apps and stuff like that. But they have a very hazy view of the content itself and its purpose. Why do we have 500,000 pages? Why do we have 16 podcasts? Why do we have all these things? What is it accomplishing for us? They may know that they have it, but at any fine grain, why do we have it is an outstanding question. And more than just better reporting tools or more granular analytics or something like that, what we need is a view of what content is working and what content is not working, and some sort of feedback loop to be able to respond to that knowledge inside of a time frame where it actually makes a difference. Hey, this campaign isn't working. Hey, this particular podcast that we do is taking off with an audience that we care about. Let's do something based on that. That kind of decision-making loop is actually why all of that data is theoretically being gathered. And it just feels like it very rarely actually produces that outcome. Figuring out ways to make that feedback loop better, both more accurate, more responsive, we've started calling that observability. We'll get into why later. We'll get into what that's analogous with in other fields later. But that's basically the key here. We need to focus more on building those effective feedback and decision-making loops than just better reporting, better analytics, X data is more accurate or whatever. So as I was digging through a bunch of old material, I found this 15-year-old slide from a talk that my partner Karen McGrain and Autogram and I delivered. Actually, I think the first presentation we ever did together. And it was about this new idea of multi-channel distribution from a single CMS. And you can see the little, the circle diagram everybody loves of all this stuff coming from content. And then we had this question at the end. It's of course, will our analytics tools actually allow us to evaluate this stuff in all these different places that it appears? And 15 years later, the answer is a resounding nope, still nope, extremely nope. There's lots of data. There's lots more data out there, but there's also way more fragmentation. That's something that we heard talked about a couple of times today, that now we've got 15 different tools that we're sort of bolting together to accomplish our mega CMS publishing needs. But now that also means we've got 15 little firewalls we have to figure out how to get data across it just to figure out where is this content even being used? How is it doing? Stuff like that. There's a lot more noise, both in terms of how much content is out there and how much we're expected to produce and distribute. And also, because that data load has grown, there's a lot more noise to try to find meaningful signal in. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also ROI pressure. Everybody is being asked to figure out how to demonstrate in a very concrete way what you do here. What do you bring to the table for the company by putting out a podcast or having better quality manuals or improving search or anything like that. And as I like to say, I didn't have gray hair before I started working in enterprise CMSs. Has nothing to do with the passage of time. I blame it entirely on technology. That feedback loop that I mentioned earlier, the idea is that, like, ideally, business goals are what drives the creation and maintenance and, use of content. And the, strategy is basically how you turn a big business goal into, the tactical, actionable stuff that you're going to produce. But strategy is ultimately, it's a story we tell ourselves about cause and effect. We think audience A is particularly interested in something, and we're going to talk about that in order to start conversations with that audience, and we believe they will keep talking to us, and eventually will talk to us about our product. It's pretty basic, but ultimately, that is a story we are telling ourselves about cause, effect. If we do this, this will happen because of what we believe about the current context we're in. We need to know if the content that we're creating based on that story is good or bad. And we also need to know if there's something wrong with that story we're telling ourselves. Have we misread the environment? Have we fooled ourselves that this is what people are interested in? Stuff like that. So on both levels, like judging the quality of this story we've told ourselves about what will happen when we do certain things, and in judging the actual quality of the specific things we're producing, we need ways of measuring that. And if we don't have that, there's basically no way to steer the car. We will produce stuff, we will hurl thousands of pages into the abyss, and hope big number goes up a year from now. That little loop right there, the sort of goal, strategy, production, measurement, that is such a wonderful, idealized little loop. I love that idea. This is what we've been talking about, like over the last year or so, as observability. That's a term we actually picked up like from the software industry, where like teams managing complex multi-component software discovered that, well, let's wait for a failure and then let's debug the 19 different things that are talking to each other to make our SaaS product run or something like that. Wasn't actually good enough. Waiting for a thing to break and then digging up what happened and why was actually disastrous, because that meant you were basically figuring out too late to actually help. They needed some sort of real-time feedback loop to figure out not just has something broken, but how healthy is it? What are the pieces doing? How are they talking to each other? Depending on the organization, some teams needed to figure out what even are all the pieces. How do we discover what the different moving pieces of our system are? And another aspect of that is watching it change over time. What has stayed consistent over the past 2 months in terms of this feature is generating a lot of load on these parts of the system and stuff like that? What has changed? What are new emergent things that we need to be aware of in how our system is operating? That kind of real-time view into not just the final outputs of the system, but what's going on under the hood is basically what we've been trying to figure out how to build into content systems that large organizations use. So, the first part of that is, what kinds of pieces of information do we need to actually look at in, let's say, the 15 different CMSs and the 92 different websites and all the spreadsheets that form the load-bearing mass of most modern organizations. The first part is composition. In the content world, this is probably equivalent to that, what are the different pieces of software that are running on all of our servers? We need a way to find that out before we judge how healthy they are. For content, that is basically like, what kinds of content exist out there? What are the different pools of content that we have? What are the properties of that content? Like, does it have different content types? Do we have podcasts over here? Do we have documentation over here? Do we have chatbot modules stored here? What are they? Where are they? What are the pieces of information that make them unique, that differ from one type to another? Another part of this is, how are we reusing content from place to place? Where are the chains of dependencies? If you've got, say, a headless CMS and an orchestration layer and another CMS that imports stuff from it, those are chains of dependency that mean somebody altering something over here can very easily break something several steps down the line without actually realizing it. And there needs to be a way to map out those flows and to see, if I do this, the chain of dominoes is going to end up altering what appears on our mobile app's landing page or something like that. That awareness needs to exist. Also, there needs to be some way of judging the quality of the stuff that we're producing. Things like, does this content meet our editorial standards? Does it hit our voice and tone guidelines? Is it accessible and readable to the audience that we're actually trying to reach? Is it actually already translated into the 3 languages we're legally required to publish things in because of where our country operates or where our company operates? Things like that. And the interesting thing is that both of these pieces, both the composition and the quality, those aren't even necessarily things that are important once it's published. These are things that we need to be thinking about just when we're very early in the content creation and production process, because that determines how it fits in, what tools we're going to be using, stuff like that. The third piece of that is the health of the content. If composition is about like, what kinds of stuff do we have? What are the bits of data that are part of it? How do they link to each other? And quality is about, does it meet the standards we have? Health is basically, okay, is it in working order? Now that it's gone out to the world, does it appear correctly on all of the endpoints we're publishing to? Is the audience going to see errors or out-of-date information or things like that? Or is the audience seeing the content at all? Have we published something into the void without realizing it's not actually being linked, it's not actually findable, it's there, but it's never actually going to be seen by anyone? And some of the traditional measures that we often use as content analytics and metrics and stuff like that, I believe are really actually health checks. They're not really about judging the effectiveness of content. They're really about saying, so is anybody visiting? That doesn't necessarily get you anything if they visited, unless you are literally selling ads and the visit is what you are trying to monetize. All it really tells you is if that number goes to 0, something's probably wrong. Or if it quintuples in one day, something has happened that we ought to probably check out. And that's sort of what we've categorized as health checks. They're important, but they don't necessarily nail the final piece, which is effectiveness. And this is where like a lot of analytics conversations tend to live. This is stuff like, is the content actually achieving its intended outcome? Does it answer the audience questions that people are coming to us with? Does it build trust or like fulfill the legal obligations we have or convince buyers? It's like, what is the content supposed to be doing, and is it actually doing that? We tend to think of these things as sort of a big bubble of like stuff that we measure in a broad, vague sense. Or maybe some of these are, that's the CMS. It's got a list of what the content is in some sort of hazy sense. But that's very much a like, what's the view of the database kind of question, not a compositional question or a quality question, stuff like that. Those kinds of things tend to get bolted on after the fact as like aftermarket dashboards that companies throw together because they need to keep track of this stuff. So if we were to gather all of that stuff together, if we had, the composition, the quality, the health, the, effectiveness stuff, how do we then make our new giant pile of data useful in that observability sense? So one of the keys is shooting for real time. As much as possible, what makes this kind of system useful is the ability to have a tight feedback loop. If all you're getting is like a quarterly roll-up report that, a room full of people labor over consolidating 19 different spreadsheets into one giant spreadsheet, and then they make the graphs and then they hand it over, that's interesting, and it can tell you what went wrong if something went badly, but it doesn't really give you the kind of forewarning or like immediate notice of what's going on to really respond within that sort of tight time frame. It's sort of like software engineers saying, well, we'll wait till the application blows up and then we'll figure out what went wrong. So whenever possible, shooting for real time, making dashboards that show what's actually going on rather than just having a PDF people can go and grab for like last quarter's numbers is a significant shift. The other is providing different ways for people to aggregate and roll up that information at the level that they need to know. Things like, how is the site doing, are very rarely useful because there's so much going on in that site that some sort of top line number like, hey, visits went up by 15% last year, doesn't tell you anything about what any of the individual strategic choices, what to publish, what to promote, what to accentuate, what to invest in, what was going on in the details. And different teams are going to need to slice that differently to figure out what they need to know to make their feedback loop work. So making sure that there are ways to like aggregate that and roll it up by like department or type of content or time frame or something like that, that's also critical. Providing some sort of context and like, simple scorecards for like the day in and day out users who are saying, okay, I'm told that this is only 97% up to par with our readability standards. What does that mean to me? Does that mean I have to rewrite this? Or does that mean I'm pretty much okay? What do I need to do? Figuring out ways to say like, hey, like 80% of the stuff that we've got out there is this good by our various quality metrics. Try to get it up to that point at least. Having those points of comparison and context for any kind of numbers that are being put out there makes a significant difference. This example over here is the state of Georgia. We worked with them on they had about 90 different sites they were all replatforming. And one of the best things that they built was this cross-site portal that rolled up things like accessibility scores, readability information for every single page, page speed, stuff like that. And it's publicly accessible, but it's intended actually for the heads of each state agency to look at and say, oh, Bob's team got their number up to 97. We should probably hit 97. It's a great way to game egos at scale. But they basically provided this sort of big picture context to show what are the hot spots, what's the stuff that's doing really well, what's not. And behind the scenes, they have even more different kinds of data that they're exposing. But this is what they felt they could confidently deliver at it's updated every single day cadence, and it covers all of their different websites, stuff like that. It's been very useful. But that other issue, providing points of comparison, also plays into that. Again, 97% as an isolated score for like page performance or content, readability doesn't tell you much unless you know what other things are scored and how they do. One of the other things that's most useful is surfacing outliers and changes. Like most sites, lots of these numbers are very boring on a day in and day out basis. That's a good thing. It means, things are humming along. What's particularly interesting is, this particular campaign that we produced actually took off in this particular way. Or, this department's content really is just off the charts in terms of reading complexity. What are we going to do about that? But figuring out where those outliers are tells you more than just those top line numbers and saying, in aggregate, we've increased by 3%. Yeah, whatever. And then finally, once those pieces are in place, it's possible to start defining and enforcing standards. That's ideally what you want to be doing, not just learning what the numbers are, but using that as a basis for deciding where you're going to invest time, where you're going to invest resources, what maybe isn't working at all and you need to pull and rethink, stuff like that. That still leaves us, though, with this ugly trailing question of what does it mean for content to actually be effective? I like to joke that, the easiest way to triple your engagement, maybe even 10x it, is to just fund the filming of a new season of Game of Thrones and put it on your website. And you will get engagement. Whether or not it serves any actual business purpose for your organization is a totally different question. But if what you've been told is to optimize engagement, and you manage to get the budget for that, you will, in fact, optimize engagement. And that ultimately is the reason that this process is difficult. It's because statistics are confusing and our brains hate us desperately. 9 times out of 10, we can't really measure the thing that we care about. What we care about is things like, does a particular type of person trust us more after reading this? That is hard to measure. So what we instead have are lots of different proxies that we measure, that we have a story we tell ourselves about how this correlates to the fact that they trust us or not. That, in turn, gets tripped up on a well-known human basic neurological thing called availability bias. Basically, information that we have in hand, we assume is somehow relevant to the question we're trying to answer. It's bounce rate may not actually mean anything based on what we're doing, but we have the bounce rate. Surely, we could put it on the dashboard and it would be useful in some fashion. The assumption that if we've gone to the work of gathering this data, it means something and is relevant to the question that we're asking is kind of baked in as a hard-coded assumption that we tend to make. There's also something called Goodhart's Law. He's a British economist. He basically, post-war, when they were trying to figure out how do we measure whether or not the British economy is growing or shrinking, one of the things a phrase that he coined was, when a metric becomes a goal, it stops being a useful metric. Sort of engagement is what we care about. Okay, somebody's going to figure out how to make number go up without necessarily actually accomplishing the tangly, complicated business goal that you sort of assumed was correlated with engagement. Once people start gaming that metric, it disconnects from that thing that you think is correlated to, because they're trying to juice that number, not necessarily the big picture. And the fourth one is lag time. Basically, the time between doing a thing and when we can measure the results of that thing. In metrics, the closer you can measure to when you actually did it, the better. And if you have to wait until the end of the year when you can look at overall company-wide sales numbers to determine whether or not a particular content campaign actually had an impact, that lag is a killer, because by the time you've figured out the answer, it's probably too late to change course. You can just make a better choice next time, hopefully. And the end result of those sort of weird, tangly biases that we automatically bring to the table is that data, even technically correct data, can often lie to us. Like a great example is a company that we worked with, SaaS application. They had a really well-developed growth marketing team, and they had like over the course of multiple years built just an absolute like straight shot from we get people to visit, we get them to sign up for a new account, and they turn into a paid user because they like using the product. That is the company's engine for being profitable. Highly optimized for that. And let the product do the selling. The job of the content is to get them in the door. The problem is when they started pivoting to do more B2B sales, everything they had built around monitoring, training, resourcing was telling them all this B2B sales support stuff that people are starting to build is failing because it does not generate individual conversions. People come, they read it, and they don't sign up for a new account. It's like, well, no, they're the procurement department of a Fortune 50 company. Their job isn't to make an account on your service and kick the tires. Their job is to talk to a salesperson, vet things, figure out all this stuff. They needed that stuff, but they needed to figure out how to tease apart those two radically different scenarios. Otherwise, they were going to be punishing themselves, even with good metrics for their original scenario. And another one, like we worked with the state of Georgia, actually, their job is basically to help people use government services, full stop. However that happens, they're thrilled. But all of their good web content got scraped by people who were just, putting up how to get a driver's license in Georgia websites, or even Google, putting things in their answer box and stuff like that. The better the content they made, the less traffic they got. And suddenly that meant, well, all the stuff we know how to look at in like Google Analytics or whatever is telling us we keep getting worse. But we know in our heads that's because we're doing a good job. And what they ended up doing is having to find other trickier measures, like does call center volume go down for topics that we roll out new content on? We may not see the direct traffic, but what we care about, our actual intent in publishing that stuff is get people getting driver's license easier. And if call center volume goes down, that's an indication that we're succeeding at it, even if we don't see the traffic. Basically, what constitutes effective is highly relative. I'll try to wrap this up a little bit because I know we're running long today. But basically, the more complex content is, the more likely it is to be highly interdependent, where some content's job is to bring people in, ultimately hand it off to other types of content whose job is to communicate other kinds of messages. Some stuff is only for one audience. Some stuff is only for certain contexts. And they all work to support each other rather than just being these little free-floating atoms of page. You have to capture what the individual intentions are for each of those pieces of content. Otherwise, down the line, there will be absolutely no way to measure whether the individual pieces of content are accomplishing their goal or not. You're just going to say, well, did it get visited? Were there conversions for that page? If you don't know whether that was a conversion page, you just know it was a page and we like conversions, you're going to get metrics that are trash. That idea of capturing intent, at least in our experience, is absolutely connected to this idea of building an effective system of observability. There's lots of technical and organizational and like data exchange problems to iron out, but the real missing piece in the vast majority of organizations we work with is they do not have a concrete measurable outcome that each piece of content is associated with, the job it's expected to do. Not like, who did we write this for, or what topic is it about, or what format is it in, or it's a podcast, or something like that. But like, if this page vanished, if it went away, what would stop happening? What problem would no longer be solved and we'd have to figure out some other way to fix it if this particular piece of content went away? Capturing that underlying like intent and the outcome that we expect to occur because we've put that content out there in the world capturing and tracking that is really the bedrock of all of the downstream observability stuff. I'll zip through a couple of these, but a lot of the ways you identify what those different intentions are the same way that like any taxonomy and IA people in the room will probably appreciate this. It's, you say, okay, let's identify the goals like engaging new users or extending our reach or generating, generating qualified leads or whatever. First, you get that list of things content needs to do. You make sure they're unambiguous, that everybody across all your different teams gets what those different labels mean, because it turns out that's very important, that language thing. If somebody's saying, we want engagement, and if somebody else is saying, we too want engagement, but what they're actually talking about is two very different measures, that's a problem. They should also be exclusive. They shouldn't overlap. Like if reach and audience are two of your labels, that probably means you've got collisions and you need to figure out how to consolidate them. And it should be exhaustive. Like once you've got that list of intents, every piece of content should have one. Even if you have to say, well, we're going to have a boardroom knife fight about it, but for now, one of the intents is a VP really wants it. Okay, so be it. At least we're honest with ourselves and we understand that is this page's purpose for existing because Dave said it has to be there. And finally, manageable. Like as hard as it is, shooting for like 5 to 10 of these things is usually what allows it to be usable at scale. It's a set of like named buckets that we can keep track of, not an exhaustive taxonomy of everything we might ever want to do. And what we've also found is when there are differences from like one department or one campaign to another, using complementary taxonomies like tagging content as being part of a campaign or related to a particular product or aimed at a particular audience, that can be used downstream to do things like slice and dice those metrics based on, oh, content for this audience with this particular intent does well in these circumstances. That's more useful than just having like the infinitely deep tree of more and more detailed intent descriptions. So I'm going to wrap up here because I think we're at time, unless anybody is desperately curious. The key here is that like phrases like, well, we just need it, aren't actually useful at any kind of scale. And what we find is when working with large organizations, huge swaths of their content basically falls into, I don't know, but, I went up last year and, Sarah's team put that together and we probably shouldn't get rid of it. It's like you need to have that idea of what it should be doing in order to measure whether or not it's doing it. And I'm going to very quickly jump to the end here. But once you've actually put that stuff together, what it gets you is a way to separate the big picture goals you're trying to accomplish from the specific things you do to measure progress for that. For example, if you know what we want to do is get in qualified leads in a particular type of content, that may take different forms from audience to audience, campaign to campaign, or whatever, and you may need to measure each one of those different approaches differently. But you can still group those under, this is qualified lead generation content. Thus, we can roughly measure how effective it is at that, even if in different ways, in different places, in different contexts, different individual numbers have to get used behind the scenes to measure it. Secondly, it gives your team a vocabulary to talk about each different piece of content's unique contribution to the big picture. That SaaS vendor who had tons of B2C content that was just grease lightning. People hit the website 10 minutes later. They've got an account, they're using it, they love it. that content isn't at war with sales support content for B2C. They complement each other, and figuring out how to articulate that each of them is doing different work and they work together. This is a vocabulary that can help build some of those bridges between teams that may feel like they're sort of fighting over whose number gets used to judge everything. Finally, it's a framework that isn't page dependent. This is a kind of approach that you can use on app analytics or email or web pages, or even on sub-page components that get used in different places. Once you know what the job of a thing is in your communications system, and you have different ways to measure that in different contexts, rolling that up to things like, is it healthy? Is it being used? Is it effective? Is it generating the outcomes we want in all these different contexts? You can use that across more than just web analytics. And also it gives you a shopping list for better data. Rather than just continually telling like the analytics team, hey, can you just get us better numbers somehow, like more detail or slice it more finely or whatever, this turns it into a question of, okay, well, we've got some okay proxy metrics for this and this and this. What could we do for this particular intent in this particular context that might get us slightly, might get us a little more accurate insight into what users are thinking, not just some correlated activity we can easily measure them doing. It turns that into an ongoing, iterable improvement process for the quality of your observation data, not we're changing the big number next month, everybody get ready. And ultimately, again, all of this is about shifting out of a better analytics, better numbers, more detail, more platforms kind of approach. Instead, stepping back and looking at it as, how do we improve our feedback loop, our decision-making loop, our ability to interrogate what we've got, examine it and say, how is it doing? What do we have? Is it working? Is it not working? What ought we do in the future? That's it. Thank you.